Hello everybody, good morning or good afternoon again. So nice to see you there again. This is the second session of the PWL International Seminar, a monthly seminar hosted by IFILNOVA in the context of the FCT-funded project Mapping Philosophy as a Way of Life, an Ancient Model, a Contemporary Approach. Our speaker today is John Sellars, who, as you know, is one of the greatest experts in the field of PWL studies and ancient studies, ancient philosophy more broadly. He's also a core member of our team, besides being an old partner of our group in Lisbon. And I'm very, very pleased to introduce him. So John Sellars is a reader in philosophy at Royal Holloway, University of London, a visiting research fellow at King's College, London, and a member of Common Room at Wolfson College, Oxford. He's author of several books on ancient philosophy, including The Art of Living, The Stoics on the Nature and Function of Philosophy, published in 2003, with a reedition in 2009, Stoicism in 2006, Hellenistic Philosophy, 2018, Lessons in Stoicism, 2019, Marcus Aurelius, 2020, The Fourfold Remedy, 2021, Bartholomew of Seminar on Stoic Ethics in 2022, and finally, Aristotle, Understanding the World's Greatest Philosopher, this year, 2023. He's currently using the notion of philosophy as a way of life as a framework to reassess the philosophy of the Renaissance. And his latest publications on this topic include the essays Renaissance Humanism and Philosophy as a Way of Life, and the Renaissance Consolations, Philosophical Remedies for Fate and Fortune. He's also a member of two non-profit organizations aimed at bringing Stoicism to a wider audience, namely Modern Stoicism and the Aurelius Foundation, and he's currently chair of Modern Stoicism. So his talk today will deal with one of the most controversial figures when assessing Hadot's interpretation of ancient philosophy as a way of life, and indeed the one who Sellars called the world's greatest philosopher, Aristotle. So his talk is titled Aristotle and Philosophy as a Way of Life, and we are very much looking forward to listen to it. So John, please, the floor is yours, and thank you for accepting to be part of this seminar.
That's great, thank you, Marta. So I've got some slides, if I can share my screen. I'm not sure if...
I believe you can share it because I made you co-host.
Okay, that's great. So I hope you can see this fine, and
yes,
you can all hear me fine. So
yes.
Yeah, let's crack on. So as Marta was saying, I'm going to talk about Aristotle and philosophy as way of life. And I think Aristotle is potentially a challenging case for Pierre Hadot's claim that all of ancient philosophy was ultimately a way of life. It's not uncommon for Aristotle to be seen as perhaps the master theoretician. He develops complex theories across a range of topics, from metaphysics to ethics to the natural and social sciences. And in this sense, Aristotle might be seen to share much in common with a typical modern academic philosopher, developing theories in practical and theoretical philosophy, examining the foundations of the sciences, and so on. Much of his time, we sense, was spent gathering information in these various areas, studying the ideas of his predecessors, examining and dissecting animals, gathering information about ancient constitutions. And all this feels a world away from the convention-flouting lifestyles of figures like Diogenes the Cynic, or from Epicurus's claim that philosophy is first and foremost a remedy for human suffering. Now, Hadot's claim that in antiquity philosophy was understood as first and foremost a way of life might seem uncontroversial when thinking about some ancient philosophical texts, perhaps the letters of Seneca or the notebook reflections of Marcus Aurelius. And in some places in his many essays, Hadot seemed to limit his claim about ancient philosophy by saying it was primarily in the Hellenistic and the Roman periods that philosophy was seen as a way of life. However, elsewhere, Hadot is quite clear that he doesn't want his claim to be limited merely to these later periods. He explicitly wanted to challenge the old narrative that presented Plato and Aristotle as the great masters of pure speculation, followed by a period of decline and fall in which the dogmatic Hellenistic schools offered mere practical ethical advice, a view that goes back to Hegel. So central to Hadot's account of ancient philosophy then is the explicit claim that Aristotle too is committed to this idea of philosophy as a way of life. The problem though, at first glance, is that Aristotle looks like the archetypal theoretical philosopher, devoted to the pursuit of knowledge above all else. Now, as it happens, Hadot was well aware of the potential challenge that Aristotle might be seen to make to his big claim. In the opening paragraph of the chapter devoted to Aristotle in his book, What is Ancient Philosophy?, Hadot writes the following: the usual idea of Aristotle's philosophy seems a complete contradiction of the fundamental thesis we wish to defend, namely that the ancient conceived of philosophy as a way of life. Certainly, Aristotle strongly asserts that the highest knowledge is knowledge which is chosen for itself and which therefore seems to bear no relation to the knower's way of life. Now, as an example of Aristotle's commitment to this pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, Hadot refers to the first book of the Metaphysics, where Aristotle comments that knowledge that is desirable in itself is closest to wisdom, and certainly closer to it than knowledge that's desirable for any results that might come from it. Thus, philosophy, the pursuit of wisdom, ought to focus its attention on the pursuit of knowledge that's desirable in itself, and not for some further practical goal, such as living a certain way of life. So this is the issue I want to explore today, right? Can Aristotle be accommodated within Hadot's model? If he cannot, that would seem to be a fatal blow for Hadot's account of ancient philosophy, because any attempt to offer a general characterization of ancient philosophy that struggles to include Aristotle can, of course, hardly be taken seriously. Now, of course, Hadot himself made a case for why he thought Aristotle could be accommodated within his model, despite first appearances to the contrary that we can see he acknowledges. Before turning to examine that case that Hadot makes, first I want to consider what Aristotle himself had to say about what he thought philosophy was. Then I want to move on and have a look at Hadot's interpretation of Aristotle, and then loop back round to take into account some further bits of evidence from Aristotle himself. So we're going to kind of jump back and forth a bit. So let's start with Aristotle himself, right? What does Aristotle have to say about what he thinks philosophy is? Well, there are a number of places where we might look for an account, and perhaps the most obvious one is the Metaphysics. In the opening chapter of Book 1, Aristotle gives an account of what he takes wisdom to be. Wisdom being the thing that philosophers are trying to secure. And famously, he opens with the statement that all human beings by nature desire to know. He goes on to suggest that our principal source of knowledge is our senses, especially sight. So our pursuit of knowledge begins with sensation. When we add to that the ability to remember, we're able to move on from bare sensation to what Aristotle calls experience. Someone who has seen the same thing happen multiple times will implicitly start to draw inductive conclusions about what might happen in the future. And while such knowledge is valuable, better still is skill or techne, which moves from a basic ability to do things to a proper understanding of how to get them done. Someone who's a real expert will have a complete understanding of how and why things happen as they do. They will, he says, possess a theory and know the causes. This sort of skill, however, is usually directed at some kind of practical or useful outcome, responding to some human need, he suggests. Higher than this is what he calls scientific knowledge, episteme, knowledge of the way the world works. This knowledge serves no practical purpose and simply fills our desire to understand the world around us. It is this knowledge, which is knowledge of first causes, he says, that Aristotle identifies with wisdom. And this is what philosophy pursues. The philosopher, the lover of wisdom, is someone who does not yet have this knowledge, but is trying to attain it. And this, Aristotle says, is a leisure activity, something to be pursued after the practical essentials of life have been secured. It is, in a sense, pointless, but certainly not in a negative sense. It's pointless in the same way that art, music, literature are all pointless, done for their own sake, because they are intrinsically valuable rather than the means to some further end. Okay, so this is what we find at the beginning of Aristotle's metaphysics. Another place where we might expect to find some comment on the nature of philosophy is Aristotle's dialogue on philosophy, which, given its title, presumably addressed this issue directly. Unfortunately, this work is lost, but fragments and testimonia that survive suggest that this was a substantial work in 10 books that in fact touched on a wide range of topics, many of which overlapped with the contents of the metaphysics. And there's one piece of evidence for this lost dialogue that seems especially relevant in the present context. The Aristotelian commentator John Sellars reports that in this work, Aristotle considered the different ways in which people use the words wisdom and wise. And according to Sellars, Aristotle mentioned 5 different ways in which one might understand these terms. So someone might be described wise if, first, they develop practically useful means to aid survival, or if they engage in artistic production, or if they offer good political leadership, or if they engage in the study of nature, or if they study unchanging divine things. And this list is presented as a hierarchy. In the most primitive societies, the person who makes advances in farming or irrigation is called wise, while in a cultured polis, those capable of artistic creation and political leadership are going to be valued more highly. Unsurprisingly, Aristotle places the study of the natural world and divine things, physics and metaphysics, higher still, and the passage ends by saying that knowledge of unchanging divine things is the highest wisdom. Now, if philosophy is to be understood as the pursuit of wisdom, and this is the highest wisdom, then presumably philosophy in its highest form is the pursuit of this kind of knowledge. Now, this hierarchy outlined in this report of Aristotle's On Philosophy clearly echoes the account in the Metaphysics, both placing purely theoretical understanding above practically oriented knowledge or skill. For Aristotle, it seems, philosophy in its highest form aims at theoretical knowledge, pursued without any regard for practical benefit. But before taking this as Aristotle's final word on the subject, we might want to attend to how he uses the word philosophia and its cognates throughout his works. Now, that's, of course, potentially a huge task, but happily, Christopher Moore has done it for us in an essay in which he offers a survey and analysis of how Aristotle uses these terms. Moore concludes that there's no single way in which Aristotle understands the term philosophy. Instead, there are a cluster of related meanings, and these include things like clever thinking, intellectual pursuit, a way of doing other activities, problem-solving activities, the pursuit of knowledge, the study of first principles, using logical argument in debate, and so on and so on. The range of uses, more comments, broadly reflects the wider use of these terms in the 4th century BC, with one or two that might be Aristotle's own additions to the list. In other words, for the most part, Aristotle is not especially innovative in his use and understanding of the word philosophy. He's simply following common usage. More than argues that we ought not to take the account of first philosophy in the metaphysics as Aristotle's authoritative or final statement on the subject, and nor should we assign any priority to this over any of the other meanings that he uses. He concludes that in Aristotle's works, philosophy is said in many ways. Now, more is surely right to caution us before coming to any kind of firm conclusions about how Aristotle understands the term philosophy. As he notes, many of Aristotle's uses simply reflect the common meanings associated with the term in his day. Even so, and with that warning duly noted, the account that Aristotle gives us in the metaphysics, along with the parallel one in On Philosophy, looks to me to be something of a different order, namely a carefully thought out attempt to define what he means by philosophy, and in particular, what he took to be the highest or most important form that philosophy could take. For Aristotle then, philosophy is an activity aimed at the acquisition of knowledge that is valuable for its own sake. It's about understanding the world in which we live, prompted by our natural desire to know. There's a sense in which this is something that all human beings do, insofar as he suggests that all humans desire to know. But it's both a descriptive and a normative claim. People naturally desire to know, but it's also by using our rationality in this manner that we become good human beings, fulfilling our function as rational animals. Okay, so that sets out in a preliminary way what Aristotle seems to think about philosophy. Let's now turn back to Pierre Hadot. There are a number of places where Hadot mentions Aristotle in the context of his reflections on the idea that in antiquity, philosophy was a way of life. The first of these can be found in a piece entitled Philosophy is a Way of Life. And this piece begins by highlighting the very practical approach to philosophy that we find in authors of the Hellenistic and Roman periods, drawing on examples from Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Sextus Empiricus, and others. However, Hadot notes that this was nothing new, and that this model of philosophy can be traced back at least to Socrates, who in turn inspired Plato, the Cynics, and other Socratic schools of philosophy. He then makes the following remark, the first passage on the screen at the moment. He says, it's sometimes claimed that Aristotle was a pure theoretician, but for him too, philosophy was incapable of being reduced to philosophical discourse or to a body of knowledge. Rather, philosophy for Aristotle was a quality of mind, the result of an inner transformation. The form of life preached by Aristotle was a life according to the mind. So he concludes the idea of philosophy as a way of life was not an innovation of the Hellenistic period. It was already embraced by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Hadot also mentions Aristotle in an essay entitled The Figure of the Sage, and there he tackles head-on the account of philosophy in the opening book of the Metaphysics. In particular, he comments that Aristotle's point of departure there is the image of the sage, the person living a certain way of life. Aristotle's focus, Hadot argues, is not wisdom in some abstract, disembodied sense, but instead the living example of the wise person. The sage who lives a life of contemplation aspires to a divine mode of life, in brief moments transcending the human condition. The goal then, Hadot implies, is not abstract theoretical knowledge, but to become a sage which means to try to become like God. In a third essay entitled Ancient Philosophy and Ethics or a Practice, we get some slightly longer remarks. As before, he begins by commenting that there's no doubt that philosophers in the Roman and Hellenistic periods engaged in a variety of practical philosophical exercises and saw philosophy as a way of life. But what about Plato and Aristotle? Weren't they the giants of pure speculation? With regards to Aristotle, Haddo writes, this is the second passage you can see at the moment, one tends to think that Aristotle's philosophy is essentially theoretic, for it truly aims at knowledge for the love of knowledge itself. There is, in this conception, a confusion between theoretic and theoretical. The theoretic is opposed to practice. The theoretic discourse is opposed to a philosophy which is practice lived and therefore practical. But the adjective theoretical designates the activity of contemplation, which for Aristotle is the highest human activity. Now, the distinction that Haddo wants to draw here doesn't easily translate into English. We might try to gloss it as a distinction between pure theory and the practice of theoretical reflection. By making this distinction, Haddo thinks he can reconcile the claims that Aristotle is most concerned with theoretical knowledge, and he sees philosophy as a lived practice. Aristotle's ultimate goal, then, is not knowledge on this view, but a life of theoretical contemplation. The remarks in these three essays that I've just mentioned very briefly are themselves very brief, not much more than a paragraph or so each. Haddo's only extended discussion of Aristotle comes in his book, What is Ancient Philosophy? And as we've already seen, the discussion of Aristotle in that book opens by fully acknowledging the problem that I outlined at the beginning, namely that a fairly common view of Aristotle's philosophy sees it as something in complete contradiction to the claim that all ancient philosophers saw philosophy as a way of life. Haddo also acknowledges that Aristotle strongly asserts that the highest knowledge is knowledge which is chosen for itself. In this discussion, then, Haddo is all too well aware of the issues we've been considering so far. In order to set out his account of Aristotle's philosophy understood as a way of life, Haddo turns to consider the Lyceum. He argues that Aristotle's school was set up as a space in which to live a philosophical life and a place to train others to do the same. It was then an institution devoted not to the acquisition of knowledge, but to living the contemplative life. Just as Aristotle claimed that knowledge is pursued for its own sake, Haddo comments that, this is the last passage you can see, life in accordance with the mind does not seek any result other than itself, and is therefore loved for itself. It's its own goal and its own reward. Now, this life in accordance with the mind is what might be called a theoretical way of life. And in this context, Haddo returns to his distinction between theoretical and the theoretic. As he notes, this isn't a distinction made by Aristotle himself, who just uses one term, theoretikos. Haddo says that Aristotle uses this term to refer to both knowledge that's pursued for its own sake and a way of life devoted to the pursuit of such knowledge. In this second sense, we can talk about something being theoretical, even though it is also entirely practical. Haddo goes on to set out what such a life might look like. To put it somewhat anachronistically, we might say it will be the life of a scholar, built around the activities of research, observation, analysis of information, and so on. But for Aristotle, this is not dispassionate study, for it's grounded in an intense sense of wonder about the natural world. It involves, Haddo says, an almost religious passion. This also comes through, he argues, in the final chapters of the Nicomachean Ethics, where the ideal of the contemplative life is described as perhaps too high a life for human beings, insofar as it's an attempt to partake in a divine activity. This idea of aspiring to divine contemplation takes us well beyond the mundane activities of the modern scholar and suggests something quite different. It also takes us beyond the acquisition of mere theoretical knowledge. The goal is nothing less than to experience, albeit in fleeting moments, what goes on in the divine mind. Hadot concludes his discussion by commenting that for Aristotle, the philosopher, for his part, should choose a life devoted to disinterested research, study, and contemplation. It's clear then that Hadot thinks that Aristotle outlines an image of an ideal way of life for a philosopher, and Aristotle himself tried to live that life and founded the Lyceum in order to create a context in which both he and others could do so. In this sense, Hadot thinks he can show that Aristotle was no exception to his claim that in antiquity, philosophy was widely understood as a way of life. Okay, so as we've seen, one central element in Hadot's account is his appeal to the idea of a contemplative life that Aristotle outlines in the final book of the Nicomachean Ethics. Earlier in the first book, Aristotle had famously considered three ways of life as potential candidates for a good human life. Seemingly dismissing the first one out of hand, a life devoted to pleasure, Aristotle focused attention on the other two, the political life and the contemplative life. Introducing both of these, Aristotle famously defers discussion of the contemplative life until later. And when he does return to it in the final book of the Nicomachean Ethics, he does so within the context of a discussion of eudaimonia, happiness. Happiness, he says, there is an activity, something intrinsically good and not for the sake of anything else. It's also an activity that is in accord with virtue or excellence, he says, adding that it makes sense to identify it with the highest human excellence. That will be the activity of the best thing in us. And the best or highest thing in us as human beings is our intellect. So the highest human excellence will be intellectual activity, namely contemplation. Now, Aristotle goes on to give a number of reasons why this is the best sort of activity. Not only is it the activity of the best part of us, the activity that results from us fulfilling our function as rational animals, but also the objects of contemplation, being objects of reason, are, he says, the best of knowable objects. And it's also the most pleasant and the most self-sufficient of activities, one that's loved for its own sake. Now, it's after this account of contemplative activity that Aristotle raises the objection that perhaps a life devoted to this sort of activity would be too high for humans. A life devoted solely to this sort of activity would be almost inhuman, potentially neglecting our physical and social needs in favor of trying to live a life more suitable for a purely rational being, namely a god. Indeed, according to Aristotle, when the intellect thinks about divine things, it becomes divine, just as the eye, when it sees red things, becomes red. To engage in contemplative activity is to transcend everyday human life and to become divine, at least for a brief moment. In response to the worry that this is an inappropriate goal for an embodied human being, Aristotle is fairly emphatic. He says, we must not follow those who advise us, being humans, to think of human things, and being mortal of mortal things, but must, so far as we can, make ourselves immortal and strain every nerve to live in accordance with the best thing in us. The highest form of activity then, identified with perfect happiness, is contemplative activity. This explains why God lives the most perfect life, so to speak, and why it would be a mistake to think that non-rational animals could live happy lives. As Aristotle puts it, happiness extends just so far as contemplation does. Okay, so in the light of all of this, it seems fairly clear that Aristotle sees contemplation as the highest human activity and identifies it with happiness or well-being. A life devoted to contemplative activity will thus be the happiest life available to a human being. And this, of course, will be the life of a philosopher. Or to be more precise, we might say it will be the life of a metaphysician who is concerned with understanding objects of reason. But as Aristotle has noted, it's also, in a sense, an inhuman life, one that aspires to divinity. No human being could live a purely contemplative life. In this sense, contemplative activity is something that humans can engage in from time to time, but not permanently. So with that thought in mind, we might draw some distinctions between a life of pure contemplative activity, which is presumably reserved for a purely rational being like God, a properly human life that nevertheless tries to devote as much time as possible to contemplation. And Aristotle founded the Lyceum, Hadot argues, in order to create a suitable environment for the latter. This human life, primarily devoted to theoretical pursuits, is contrasted then with the political life, who's someone who prioritizes the activities and the business of the wider community. Now, a number of commentators have challenged the idea that there's a sharp division between the contemplative life on the one hand and the political life on the other. And this, of course, has been a huge topic in the literature on Aristotle's ethics. I'm just going to touch on a couple of contributions to this. A very long time ago, J.A. Stewart, in his commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, commented that the theoretical life is not a separate life coordinate with the political life, but a spirit which penetrates and ennobles the latter. He continued by adding that the image of Aristotle's contemplative life as a complete withdrawal from everyday social activity was how the Neoplatonists read Aristotle. But, I quote, "Nothing could be more opposed than this to Aristotle's view of life as social from beginning to end." And with that thought in mind, one could imagine someone accusing Hadot, the great scholar of Neoplatonism, of giving an overly Neoplatonic reading of Aristotle when he describes contemplative activity as an almost religious experience. More recently, Matthew Walker and CDC Reeve have both defended a view similar to Stewart's. Walker has argued that we ought to see contemplation not as some separate, almost superhuman way of life, but rather as a thoroughly human activity that can guide all human action. By contemplating the divine, Walker argues, we gain valuable insights into our own limitations, finitude, and mortality that can inform how best to live. The activity of nous, then, is but one of a series of natural biological functions, and as such, a vital part of any good human life. And similarly, Reeve has argued that the best political and contemplative lives are not so much two separate lives as distinct phases of the same life. However, despite those attempts to suggest that we ought not to see two radically opposed lives, elsewhere, Aristotle seems fairly emphatic that he is operating with such a distinction, in particular in the Politics, where he says the following. He says, even those who agree in thinking that the life of excellence is the most desirable raise a question whether the life of business and politics is or is not more desirable than one which is wholly independent of external goods. I mean, than a contemplative life, which by some is maintained to be the only one worthy of a philosopher. For these two lives, the life of the philosopher and the life of the statesman, appear to have been preferred by those who have been most keen in the pursuit of excellence, both in our own and in other ages. Which is the better is a question of no small moment. So it seems fairly clear here, in this passage, that Aristotle is indeed thinking about two distinct ways of life. And he explicitly refers to a contemplative life and identifies it with the life of a philosopher. Now, a separate but highly relevant question also concerns the motivation for wanting to live such a life devoted to contemplation. Why might one want to do so? In particular, does one engage in the activity of contemplation simply for its own sake or for the sake of something else, such as the pursuit of happiness? In short, why would one want to live the life of a philosopher? Aristotle addressed this very question directly in his Protrepticus, which gives a whole series of arguments for why one ought to do philosophy. And although this work, like on philosophy, is lost, a number of fragments survive, the most important of which come from a work of the same name, Protrepticus, by Iamblichus. And in these fragments, what we find are multiple arguments designed to persuade people that they ought to do philosophy. And some of these arguments might be described as dialectical, insofar as they seem to presuppose different assumptions about what matters most, but they all lead to the same conclusion, namely that one indeed ought to do philosophy. And the aim here, no doubt, was to try to convince as many people as possible, no matter what their underlying views might be. Now, the first type of argument that Aristotle uses states that philosophy delivers certain external benefits. It's useful, for instance, for lawmaking, and it will also lead to good ethical action. Thus, he comments, we should do philosophy if we are going to engage in politics correctly and conduct our own way of life in a beneficial way. The second type of argument that he uses also suggests a benefit derived from the activity of philosophy, namely happiness or well-being, eudaimonia. Philosophy, he argues, is the only activity that makes life worth living. He says that only philosophers will lead a happy life, and that philosophy is living perfectly well, or at least the greatest cause of it. The third type of argument insists on the value of doing philosophy for its own sake, regardless of any further benefit that one might gain. It's an activity valuable in itself, and it's the highest activity that humans can undertake. It enables us to fulfill our function as rational beings, and so there's a sense in which we only fully exist and are most completely alive when we engage in this activity. And as we've already seen, the highest form of philosophy is contemplation of the divine. In the Protrepticus, interestingly, Aristotle says that the philosopher will spend their lives looking at nature and the divine. And this looks as if it potentially broadens out the focus of philosophical activity. And I'll come back to that issue a little later. The different types of argument in the Protrepticus are clearly aimed at different audiences. If someone thinks that the only reason to engage in an activity is for the benefits they might gain from it, then Aristotle can offer them arguments as to why they ought to do philosophy. But taking the material as a whole, it's fairly clear that he doesn't share that view. Elsewhere, he's highly critical of the idea that one ought to look for benefit in everything. Some things are just intrinsically valuable and done for their own sake. Doing philosophy will indeed benefit its practitioner in a variety of ways, including enabling them to enjoy a happy life. But that's not the primary reason to do it. The principal reason is, one might say, more fundamental than that. To use a common Aristotelian argument, eyes are for the sake of seeing, that's their function. If someone had eyes but never opened them, the capacity of sight would never be used. The potentiality would never be actualized. Insofar as their very existence as eyes is defined in terms of their function, there's a sense in which eyes that never get the opportunity to see fail to be eyes in the fullest sense. And the same applies to a human being who fails to use their capacity for reason. In order to fully be human at all, one must do philosophy. Aristotle says, the function of the soul, either alone or most of all, is thinking and reasoning. Therefore, it is now simple and easy for anyone to reach the conclusion that he who thinks correctly is more alive, and he who attains truth lives most. And this is the one who is wise. Thus we attribute living more to the one who is awake rather than the one who is asleep, and to the one who is wise more than the one who is foolish. And that again is from the Protrepticus fragments. Now, in the case of sight, being able to see obviously brings a range of practical benefits. It enables us to do many things. Aristotle comments that the same applies to philosophical contemplation. It can be practically beneficial in a variety of ways. But in both cases, the benefits are merely welcome byproducts. Even if someone gained no practical benefit from seeing, they would still prefer to be able to see than not, Aristotle suggests. And the same applies to contemplation. Now, despite this focus on the intrinsic importance or indeed necessity of philosophy as an activity, Aristotle also stresses that it's only through philosophy that it will be possible to live a happy life. At one point, he comments, living pleasantly and feeling true enjoyment belong only to philosophers, or to them most of all. So the activity of philosophy is the key to living a good life, and the philosopher's way of life is the best one there is. Yet, as we've seen, the benefit is not the principal reason to do it. Elsewhere in one of the common books, shared by the Nicomachean and the Eudemian ethics, Aristotle expresses this view with two seemingly contradictory statements. First, he says that philosophical wisdom does not contemplate any of the things that make humans happy, while later adding that such wisdom does produce happiness. Yet, we can now see how these two statements might be reconciled. Philosophy is not primarily concerned with issues relating to how to live a happy life, but nevertheless, the activity of philosophy will generate happiness. Or, to put it another way, the activity of philosophy perhaps should simply be identified with happiness or well-being. So, what's philosophy concerned with most of all? As we saw, he presents it as contemplative activity in Nicomachean ethics, being concerned with the contemplation of divine things and objects of reason. In the metaphysics, he suggests both first principles and divine things as the highest objects of study. And in the Protrepticus fragments, as we saw a little earlier, he seemed to put the study of nature on a par with the contemplation of divine things. Aristotle gives us a fuller explanation of the relative standing of these two areas of study on parts of animals. And in the process addresses one of our other questions as well about how this activity relates to happiness. So in parts of animals, Aristotle says that natural things fall into two kinds, the ungenerated and eternal, and those subject to generation and decay. And while the former, ungenerated and eternal, are superior, they are harder for us to know. By contrast, things in the changing natural world, such as plants and animals, are close to hand and readily accessible to our senses. So he concludes that the study and contemplation of both types of entity are equally valuable for us. The pleasure that we gain from contemplating divine things is greater, but limited in quantity. What we gain from the study of the natural world might be slightly lesser in some ways, but we can engage in it far more often and in greater depth. So formally, metaphysics is superior to physics, but practically, physics offers greater opportunities for philosophical contemplation. And so for different reasons, the two are equally valuable areas of study. And Aristotle goes on to stress the immense pleasure that can be gained from the study of nature, especially the study of animals, that he obviously devoted so much of his own time to. This pleasure comes from understanding the causes of things. All natural things, he says, even the superficially ugly, are marvelous. And here perhaps we get a glimpse into Aristotle's own psychology and the pleasure and satisfaction that he gained from the study of animals. Yet it's equally clear that the pleasure is not the prime motivation. He's motivated simply by a desire to understand. However, at the same time, Aristotle has also argued elsewhere that the highest good at which all human activity aims is well-being, happiness. In a discussion of different types of persuasive writing in his Rhetoric, he comments that all advice to do things or not to do them is concerned with happiness and with the things that make for or against it. Whatever creates or increases happiness or some part of happiness, we ought to do. And whatever destroys or hampers happiness or gives rise to its opposite, we ought not to do. Now, in that in mind, we might expect the Protrepticus, which is a piece of persuasive writing urging people to do philosophy, to be in some way concerned with happiness. And as we've seen, it certainly is. That it will make one happy is one of the reasons that Aristotle gives as to why we ought to do philosophy. To someone looking for happiness, someone looking for guidance in how to live well, Aristotle's response is unambiguous, that philosophy is the answer. And one could even construct a simple argument along the following lines. All humans desire happiness. The only activity that can deliver happiness is philosophy. Therefore, all humans should pursue philosophy. But this doesn't involve the claim that philosophy is directed towards happiness, only that it delivers it. It's directed towards understanding the natural world, broadly conceived. So in an appropriately Aristotelian way, the issue is ultimately one of determining the telos of philosophy. What's its goal or purpose? And on this point, Hadot himself was quite clear, commenting that Aristotle's image of a life of intellectual inquiry does not seek any result other than itself, and is therefore loved for itself. It's its own goal and its own reward. Okay, so let me start to wrap things up now. Let me come back and assess Hadot's claim that Aristotle understood philosophy as a way of life. It's certainly clear that Aristotle understood philosophy as an activity, as something that one does. It's also clear that Aristotle sees this activity as a vital part of any human life. Indeed, at one point in the Protrepticus fragments, he argues that given much of human life can be difficult and miserable, philosophy is the only thing that can make it bearable. We ought, he concludes, either to do philosophy or say goodbye to life and depart from this world, since all other things anyway seem to be a lot of nonsense and foolishness. However, there's little to suggest that Aristotle ever presented philosophy as such, as a practical guide to how to live well, or that his principal motivation for doing this activity was in order to transform his life for the better. So, whether Aristotle fits within Hadot's framework all depends on precisely how Hadot understood the phrase, philosophy is a way of life. The most common way in which Hadot tries to explain it in his works is by drawing a contrast between philosophical discourse on the one hand, and a way of life on the other. Philosophy, he argues, ought to be identified with the latter, a way of living, rather than a body of theoretical knowledge. And echoing remarks by Socrates, by Seneca, and even by Nietzsche, Hadot insists that philosophy ought not to be reduced to the mere critique of words by other words. What matters is not what one says, but what one does. Now, this idea was very forcefully expressed by the Stoic philosopher Epictetus when he challenged his students for not acting in accordance with their professed doctrines, merely mouthing the words of the Stoics, but not living in agreement with them. That seems to fit Hadot's model really well. But as it happens, Aristotle had already expressed a very similar view. It is, he commented, only by performing virtuous actions that someone becomes virtuous. However, he comments, most people do not do these virtuous actions, but instead take refuge in theory and think they're being philosophers and will become good in this way, behaving someone like patients who listen attentively to the doctors, but do none of the things they are ordered to do. As the latter will not be made well in body by such a course of treatment, the former will not be made well in soul by such a course of philosophy. Now, this looks like a clear affirmation of precisely the distinction that Hadot draws between philosophical discourse on the one hand and philosophy as a way of life. And it also makes use of the medical analogy common in ancient accounts of philosophy as a transformative practice that we find in Socrates and onwards. It appears in the context of a discussion of the importance of habituation in ethical development, and Aristotle's concern with habituation might be taken to share something in common with Hadot's interest in what he calls spiritual exercises. And while Aristotle's remark is concerned with ethical development rather than philosophy in general, as we've already seen, Aristotle presents all philosophy as an activity, a practice, something that one does, rather than something one merely talks about. Indeed, another key feature in Hadot's account of ancient philosophy is the claim that it was first and foremost a practice. He's quite insistent in a number of places that, I quote, theory is never considered an end in itself. It is clearly and decidedly put in the service of practice. Now, at first glance, that might seem to conflict with Aristotle's claim that theoretical knowledge is an end in itself and not pursued for the sake of anything else. But of course, it all depends on how we understand the word practice. Aristotle would surely deny that theoretical knowledge ought to be pursued for the sake of some further practical end. But as we've seen, he also understands philosophy as an activity, the actualizing of our potential as rational beings. And in this sense, philosophy is always a practice. Indeed, in the Politics, Aristotle is insistent that even a quiet life devoted to contemplation ought to be seen as an active one, commenting that nor are those ideas only to be regarded as practical, which are pursued for the sake of practical results, but much more the thoughts and contemplations which are independent and complete in themselves. This is contemplation as practice. And when understood in this way, it looks as if Aristotle, in fact, fits surprisingly well into Hadot's account of ancient philosophy as a way of life. But in order for this to be the case, one must understand philosophy as a way of life as something broader than just guidance on how to live well. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for such a thorough and illuminating talk. Thank you also for respecting the time. We have now around 30 minutes for discussion, and I'm sure there will be plenty of questions. Helder has already raised the hand. Please.
Thank you very much, John, for this lovely presentation. I was already familiarized with much of the analysis from having read the similar version in text. And this time, I was wondering about how you relate what you said, especially now at the end, with the notion of spiritual exercise. And perhaps this anticipates a bit what you'll say in the conference in later this year. But I'm especially thinking about the way Aristotle's description of activity as energeia seems to be quite different from exercise as ascesis. So in several descriptions several of those accounts of spiritual exercise, he focused this idea that they aim at transformation. So they have an end, they are a kind of ergon. And this seems different from pure energeia, pure contemplation, which has no end in itself. And it probably wouldn't be able to be described as ascesis, because ascesis has this idea of a suffering, a pornos that one must go through in order to become something else, in order to change one's own being. And energeia, at least for someone who has already reached wisdom, assuming that is possible, would be something quite different. So would you agree, would you have to rethink the notion of spiritual exercise in light of this notion of energeia, or should we do away with it and put it aside when we are describing the life of the contemplative philosopher? What do you think about this?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. That's really interesting. So to be brief, I mean, I agree with you. So I think that we shouldn't identify the idea of spiritual exercise with energeia and that kind of activity. So I think the point I was sort of hinting at the very end was that we might identify spiritual exercises with habituation in the ethics, which again is an activity aimed at transformation, right? So I think the parallel would be between ascesis and then habituation in the Nicomachean Ethics rather than an energeia. Now, whether that is a perfect fit is something to think about more. Hadot is quite clear, I think, that he is deliberately avoiding phrases like mental training. He wants to hold on to the phrase spiritual exercise in order to indicate the more substantial transformation that he has in mind. And you're absolutely right. I am going to try and think about this more before we get to for the conference in Lisbon. So I suppose then the question becomes, does what Aristotle has to say about habituation and training have the kind of characteristics that Hadot thinks are important for his idea of spiritual exercise, or whether it's something a bit more mundane, right? And yeah, so I think that would be the question that that we need to think about some more.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Stelios Virvidakis, please.
Yes, thank you so much for this illuminating talk. Now, you haven't mentioned, and I wonder to what extent Hadot uses the notion of phronesis. I mean, phronesis didn't come into the presentation. So I just wanted to ask, of course, you emphasized the, Sophia and the theoretical part, but I wonder to what extent Hadot, I don't remember the text, draws on the book on phronesis and its uses. And another question, again, I don't remember whether how he translates eudaimonia. Is it bonheur, or does he use something more like flourishing, like épanouissement or something like that? But I don't remember the French Hadot's texts. But anyway, I mean, I suppose you may want to bring phronesis into the picture at some point.
Yes, thank you. No, I didn't. So yes, I I was fairly brief on the political life and the life of Phronesis. An hour was enough for you guys, right? That could have been that would have made it even longer. I don't think Hadot says that much about that. His focus seems to be primarily on the contemplative life. I think, yeah, the literature on the relationship between the life of Phronesis and the life of Theoria is obviously huge. That would be a huge rabbit hole to go down. But yeah, Hadot doesn't comment on it that much. His reading seems to be, and like I say, he doesn't write a huge amount about Aristotle. So far as I've seen, his focus really is on bringing out the kind of religious aspect of Aristotle's life. And as I said, there's a sense in which you might see it as a fairly Neoplatonic reading of Aristotle, which, you know, is no great surprise. I mean, as for how he translates eudaimonia into French, I don't have it to hand, I'm afraid, but that is in itself a really interesting question, and I'll certainly...
Because, as you know, with Phronesis, again, there is a debate among French scholars. There was a debate, like whether you translate it as sagesse or prudence. I mean, it goes back to Aubank and Gautier Joliffe on these issues. But anyway, this is thank you. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely, and yeah, and translation is interpretation for sure. So yeah, thank you very much.
Matteo?
Oh yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Hi, John. So many thanks for your presentation. I think that was really great. So if I'm not mistaken, in Hadot's account, what seems to differentiate the life of the scholar, say the life of the modern contemporary professor of philosophy, from the contemplative life that was advocated by Aristotle, is this idea of the divinization of the philosopher, the sort of idea that a philosopher is at a certain point, even however briefly, assimilated to the divine. So I was wondering whether you think that that's a fair criteria by which discerning philosophers that conceive philosophy as a way of life, as Aristotle, from those who apparently or allegedly didn't, such as contemporary scholars and philosophers.
That it's partaking in a divine way of life.
Right. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, in Hadot's account, what really distinguishes the life of the scholar from the life, you know, the contemplative kind of life that was advocated by Aristotle, is this idea of the divine contemplation. So Hadot's argument for including Aristotle in the traditional philosophy as a way of life seems to be, at least at a certain level, grounded upon this idea of the assimilation to the divine or something like that, or the divinization of the philosopher to remain big enough.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the focus throughout Hadot's work is the idea that there's a radical transformation of the individual, right? And that Aristotelian example would be one case of radical transformation. But we can think of other ancient philosophers who aren't going to be thinking in those sorts of terms, right? So if you're thinking of, say, I don't know, Diogenes the Cynic or something, he also has gone through a radical transformation in the sense that he's living a radically different way of life to the multitude of citizens. And so I suppose that and again, as I was saying earlier in the previous with the previous question, the idea of spiritual exercise involving, you know, a significant change in one's being, as Hadot puts it, right? And so that kind of contact with divine activity might be one radically transformative experience, but it might take other forms as well. And I suppose the polemic against the modern scholar that Hadot is making, following Nietzsche and others, is, well, you know, the scholar goes to work, they do their bit, they go home, and then they just carry on as if nothing's changed. And, you know, and we all know all of the horrific stories of, you know, professors of ethics who, you know, don't know how to act ethically, right? I mean, that's the that have not gone through that radical process of transformation. So I think the divine activity is one way in which that radical transformation could cash out, but it's not the only one.
Perfect. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Thank you, man. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianfranco.
Thank you very much, John, for this presentation. For me, very, very interesting too. Really, I have two questions, but they are very, very related between them, and they descend also from what you said, distinguishing somehow the interpretation of Ado to what Aristotle really said. And what I want to ask you is precisely, about the interpretation of Ado of the scholastic and of Thomism, in particular, it is a sort of a medieval philosophy descending from an Aristotelian interpretation. And what you said about the role of contemplative philosophy for an idea, a notion of philosophy as way of life in Aristotelian case can or cannot be also related with the notion of philosophy in Thomism, or in scholasticism. Because in the sense, if we agree with you and with Aristotle too, that the contemplative life is absolutely pivotal for an interpretation of a philosophy of as way of life, also Thomism or scholasticism, also logical philosophy, that is absolutely pivotal for scholasticism. It's also important for contemplative life, and also in the sense of, for philosophy as a way of life. And of course, my question is absolutely related with Ado's interpretation of the break that the Thomism and the scholasticism would constitute for the canon of the history of philosophy as well as life. This was the first question. The second question is related to what with what you said about the contemplative life in the sense of contemplation of natural things and of science in the sense. And thinking about what modern philosophy, beginning with Galileo's, but also to the last physics, contemporary physics, I think to Liz Moulin, but to Einstein, and so on. Why cannot we say, also thinking to the ethical relevance of thought for many scientists, I think to Einstein, for instance, if we cannot say that the science in itself can be approached as a form of philosophy, or science as a particular physics, but I think also to other disciplines cannot or be interpreted as a form of philosophy as well as life. These are the two questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I mean, I think in both cases, my short answer would be yes. So certainly, I can see why we might think of something like Thomism and the way in which Aquinas is reflecting on these ideas could fit within this context. I mean, there are those very old-fashioned English language arguments about medieval philosophy, and Aquinas isn't. Bertrand Russell will say things like, "Well, Aquinas isn't really doing philosophy because his religious faith has already determined what the answers are going to be." So there are those kinds of sort of objections, but no, absolutely, I think there's no reason why we can't include his work within this tradition, for sure. I mean, as for the scientists, Yeah, absolutely. I don't see any reason why we couldn't think about contemporary scientists also thinking in these terms, particularly when the things that they're studying are having a profound existential impact on how they understand themselves and their place in the world. And surely it does, right? And there are the contingencies of the way in which modern universities have developed that mean that we think that the natural sciences are distinct from philosophy. But of course, Newton was a natural philosopher, and one could imagine a department of, a modern department of physics being called a department of experimental philosophy within a faculty of philosophy, if universities were simply organized differently. And the divisions between these subjects would not seem quite so stark. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Georgi Vaknadze. I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
It's okay, no worries. Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful lecture. It was very inspiring. I have a question, if it's okay. I want to bring Foucault into this, Michel Foucault. So my question would be, what is the difference between Hadot's notion of spiritual exercises and Foucault's notion of technologies of the self? And why can't we think of spiritual exercises within the context that Foucault uncovered in his work, the difference between the know thyself and the care for yourself? In your book, you mentioned they're different. If you could elaborate on these differences between Hadot's and Foucault's maybe views of ancient philosophy, but specifically within the context of spiritual exercises. Thank you. Yeah,
sure. Gosh. So yeah, in the book I wrote 20 years ago, right? So I mean, to pick up on some of the things that we've just been saying, I think this is from memory and impressionistic, but even so, I think Foucault's notion of technologies of the self is perhaps just a bit more down to earth than Hadot's idea of spiritual exercises. And as we've touched on in the discussion already, when Hadot's talking about spiritual exercises, there is this kind of religious element there in some sense. There's this idea that it's not merely mental training, it's something more profound and more significant than that. Whereas, and I think that inevitably reflects the fact that Hadot was, of course, a serious scholar of Neoplatonism. Where if you think about the key points of reference for someone like Foucault, I mean, at one point in an interview, Foucault commented that his favorite ancient author was Seneca. He was reading a lot of the Hellenistic authors. And I think that those were perhaps his points of reference. There was that sort of Socratic tradition that is developed by the Stoics of practical training that is very kind of down to earth, and doesn't necessarily have perhaps quite the same religious connotations that some of the material that Hadot is drawing on. Now, that may be a kind of a false dichotomy, and it may be if we dig deeper into it, we'll actually find that those positions come a bit closer together. But that's my kind of initial sort of impressionistic view.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Leonard? We can't hear you, Leonard.
Yes, it's strange because the microphone is activated or supposedly activated, but it's not getting any sound, so we don't hear anything.
Leonard, we can't hear you. Maybe you can write your question on the chat, and then we read it afterwards. I see that Mariana also wants to speak, and then we go to Leonard's question on the chat.
Should I
Yes,
start?
please.
Okay. Well, I was thinking whether I should say something or not, but in the end I decided to do it. Probably I'm going to ruin Aristotle's party, but well, whatever. First of all, thank you very much for the talk. I listened very carefully to it. And as somebody who is partial to Plato, I must say that all the things you said, I think, could have been said by Plato too. So I don't see much originality really in Aristotle. Maybe he was not trying to be original. He was just systematizing the thoughts of his teacher. But I also think that it all goes back to Socrates. And I think he's the model of the philosopher. And this continues, of course, in the Hellenistic and the Roman period. So that's what I was thinking. We should just go back to Plato and then read Aristotle with Plato on our mind. So maybe you can, of course, you mentioned Plato and Socrates, yeah, of course, but maybe you can add a little bit to it with the view to my comment. And another very concrete question is about the Protrepticos. How sure can we be that it is really Aristotle's text that Iamblichus is citing or modifying, or I don't know how to say it, because as far as I remember, not everybody is of this opinion. I mean, the modern scholars, and there is not even the mention of the name of the author. And some of the things you pointed yourself somehow don't agree with the other ideas we find in Aristotle. So should we think about this text as stemming in some way from Aristotle's youthful work, I suppose Protrepticus was, or not? Or should we just be very careful while reading it and commenting upon it? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, lots of interesting questions. So, as it happens, I was looking at a paper this morning by Christopher Rowe, in which he argues that ultimately Aristotle's view comes very close to Plato's in terms of the relationship between contemplation and political engagement, the philosopher coming, going back into the cave and engaging in political activity. And so he suggests that ultimately their positions are quite close to one another. So you're not alone in thinking that at the end of the day, Plato and Aristotle might be quite close on all of this. And you are, of course, absolutely right that so much of this goes back to Socrates. But I think Aristotle is bringing quite a lot to the table that's new and that goes beyond what Socrates was doing. And in particular, his interest in biology and his study of the natural world, which I think really does sort of broaden out his conception of what philosophy is beyond what we see the Socrates in Plato do most of the time. I know there's the Timaeus, but so I do think Aristotle's bringing something new to the table, but absolutely, Plato is an enormous point of reference for him as well. As for the Protrepticus, I completely understand your skepticism. And to be honest, when I first started looking at this, I was also quite skeptical. Why should we believe that these passages are reflecting Aristotle's thoughts? But I read the piece by Monty Johnson and Doug Hutchinson, where they really give a defense of these passages coming from Aristotle, and they translate the passages as well. And I have to say, despite going into it with quite a lot of skepticism, they completely convinced me. I think they gave a really strong case as to why we ought to take these passages as being Aristotelian. And I think that their arguments have been very widely accepted. I think that there is now a reasonable consensus on this.
Can you tell us where this was published? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure. So it's a very substantial article in Oxford Studies in Ancient Philosophy, and Monty Johnson, one of the authors, has helpfully scanned a copy and posted it on his Academia Edu site, so it's easily accessible there.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I will now recover Leonard's question. He says in the chat, I can't understand the names of the authors you mentioned, Leonard, but okay, according to some authors, sorry, John, can you?
Yeah, so it's Stewart, Walker, and Reeve.
Ah, okay. The accounts of Stewart, Walker, and Reeve deny the distinction between the life of practical activities like business and politics and the contemplative life. Reeve's response is that Aristotle himself insists on this distinction.
I think it's John's response.
Okay.
Your response.
Okay.
That was also John's response.
So the problem here is that completely the same versus completely different is a false choice. They can also be continuous and mutually informing. The question is whether we should consider this a false dichotomy. Leonard,
Yeah.
I hope I reproduced it right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, that's a very good question. It's a huge topic. You know, it almost feels like the majority of the scholarly literature on the Nicomachean ethics is on this issue, and there's so much to explore. So yeah, I don't have a definitive answer to this, but you're absolutely right. There's so much discussion both ways. But I mean, I just think that passage that I pointed to from the Politics, where Aristotle explicitly talks about two lives, is just another interesting piece of evidence to throw into the discussion. And often the interpretations are entirely internal to the Nicomachean ethics. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to sort of highlight that passage. We see Aristotle, at least in that one place, explicitly refer to two lives. But that doesn't mean that we ought to think of it as a rigid dichotomy. And it doesn't mean that just because he says it there, that's his final considered view. I mean, I think all of us who have spent time reading Aristotle will know that, you know, he puts things forward, he presents hypotheses, he's often quite cautious. You know, he's a slippery fellow, he's difficult to pin down. But thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. I would also have two short questions, and since nobody else raised their hands, I think I will take the opportunity to make my questions. I totally agree with you, John, that when approaching a certain figure of the history of Western philosophy, and especially in ancient philosophy, through the lens of PWL and Hadot's interpretation, much comes down to how you interpret philosophy as a way of life. And often you really need to make, you really need to use a broader understanding of philosophy as a way of life than perhaps Hadot might have intended. One thing that makes it difficult to apply PWL to many authors is the idea of spiritual exercises, which you already talked about. Another one is the idea of the cosmic perspective, or the perspective of the whole, which for Hadot is also at the core of ancient philosophy, is also the main aim of spiritual exercises. And here I would ask you if you think there is something of the sort in Aristotle, and also if this is fundamental in Hadot's account, or can we use Hadot's account eliminating the idea of spiritual exercises and the perspective of the whole, keeping simply the idea of philosophy having an impact or transforming one's life, etc. The second question I have already discussed a bit with you has to do with motivation. With the motivation, I noticed that in your work, this is a fundamental question to you. This is in this text, whether Aristotle fits or not in the PWL model. It is fundamental to understand what is the real motivation, or what is the primary motivation. Is it theory by itself, knowledge by itself, or is it happiness? Also in your article, which we all know very well, published in Parisia, on what is philosophy as a way of life, you also put a lot of emphasis, or the idea that to change one's way of life, it's the primary motivation of philosophy, is one of the distinguishing marks for you of philosophy as a way of life. But I wonder if that is really fundamental in Hadot's account. That is, couldn't it happen that a philosopher didn't have the transformation of one's life as his or hers primary goal, and yet the incorporation of a certain body of knowledge, of a certain theory, would necessarily change your way of life, even if it wasn't the motivation of the philosopher, but simply as a way of understanding philosophy in general. Or if we take philosophy as a way of life to be also a normative model of what philosophy should be, wouldn't it just be the idea that philosophy should have an impact in one's life, should transform you, independently of that being the primary motivation of the philosopher or not? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So as for the first question, everyone likes to ask two questions at once, right? As for the first question, so yeah, I mean, I don't think there's quite that sort of cosmic perspective idea in Aristotle. I mean, that really just comes from Marcus Aurelius, right? I mean, Hadot takes that from the Meditations. Whether he is seriously suggesting that that's a kind of a generalizable characteristic across all ancient philosophy, or whether it's just one clear example of the sort of thing he has in mind, I mean, I think I'm more inclined to the latter idea, right? It's an example of an exercise, but it's not as if it's a foundational one or a central one.
He says it's the main aim of spiritual exercises, and since he says there are spiritual exercises in the whole of ancient philosophy, then it makes it the goal of ancient philosophy to create this cosmic perspective.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is something that I will look at a bit more before we get to the conference in the summer. So I'll come back to you on that one.
Okay.
But I don't think that it is across the board. As for the question about motivation, yes, you're absolutely right. It's something I've thought about quite a lot. And so here's the kind of here's the autobiographical footnote to this paper that didn't get read out, right? So, I mean, when I first started looking at this topic to write this paper, it was very much to pick up on very passing comments I'd made about Aristotle in the past, both in the Art of Living book a long time ago, and then in that piece for Parasia, which was just a conference talk I wrote for Matt Sharp some years ago. In both of those cases, I tried to draw a distinction between Socrates on the one hand and Aristotle on the other. And I suggested that the question of motivation was one way to think about that distinction, and that Socrates was very much engaged in philosophy in order to try to learn how to live a good life, and that was his motivation, right? Whereas Aristotle didn't seem to have that motivation. It looked like he was doing something slightly different, playing a different game, we might say. And that might be one reason why we might think that Aristotle doesn't fit into the philosophy of way of life model. So this paper was an attempt to dig into that further. And the first version of this paper, which I read about this time last year in Athens, continued to argue for that interpretation, right? And continued to suggest that Aristotle probably didn't fit into philosophy as way of life model. But then I was doing more work on this last summer. And ultimately, as I dug further into the material, I changed my mind. And so the conclusion of this paper, which is that Aristotle does probably fit in this model, is not the one that I was intending to argue for at all. And so I have shifted my view. And I think the conclusion that I come to in this paper precisely does set that question of motivation to one side, along the lines that you were suggesting, whereby that might not be the reason why one engages in activity, but nevertheless, it can still be radically transforming. So I think we're getting closer to each other on that topic. And my view is, I think, has shifted precisely through working on this paper that I was reading today.
Just for curiosity, would you also take out that characteristic from your framework of what is philosophy as a way of life from that paper from 2017, if I'm not mistaken? That is really one of the core characteristics of the model. You try you're, I think, one of the first scholars to try to characterize the model, right, in metaphilosophical terms. And I think the first characteristic is the primary motivation to do philosophy is to change one's way of life. Would you also change that, or?
Maybe.
Okay.
I'll go back and have another look at it.
Okay, we'll keep discussing about this.
Yeah, it's obviously something that has. So yeah, I mean, on another occasion, we should have a discussion about why it is you're so strongly concerned about that, and why you think that is problematic as a characteristic of philosophy as a way of life.
I myself need to think why that is important for me. But yeah, looking forward to that talk. And thank you so much once again, John, for this beautiful talk and this kind of discussion. Thank you also, all of you, for being there and for making the questions. The next session of the seminar will be on the 10th of May, same time, and our speakers will be Eli Kramer and Leonard Wachs, who will give a talk on John Dewey on the social-cultural role of philosophy as a way of life. You will receive the usual reminders, and I hope we can all meet again then. So thank you again, have a great day, and see you next time. Bye-bye. Thanks.